With great gain, eventually comes great tragedy. The theme to Aerith Gainsborough, one of the lead characters in Final Fantasy VII, strikes both an emotional punch, yet also a hopeful atmosphere. The melody itself can be conducted in both a happy and lighthearted way, as it appears when you first meet her, and it can also become a more beautiful and sensitive piece as well, as we will see in the following analysis. The score of Final Fantasy VII is widely regarded as one of the best in video game history, despite the limitations Nobuo Eumatsu had to face. He originally wanted to compose the score using CD quality music, featuring live vocal performances, but unfortunately the team at Square decided that the extra capacity of audio extended the load times of each area too much. The decision was made to use only the MIDI capabilities of the PlayStation. One wonders what the score could have been like with higher quality samples. Eumatsu himself stated that he wanted the score of the game to portray like a movie. He used more mood-type pieces rather than melodic statements to better underlie each scene of the game. I believe, as do many others, that this approach was the right one for the game. Spread out yet selective is what I would call Eumatsu's instrument choices. A more traditional orchestral arrangement is used, featuring all the families of the orchestra. Surprisingly though, there is no percussion of any kind. You would sort of expect there to at least be cymbal crashes, but Eumatsu covers this well through his composing. I've arranged the instruments you see here sort of backwards from a traditional way, so bear with me. I've arranged them when these instruments appear in the music, so you have the piano and harp starting out first on top, then the first three strings, the high strings, and the cello and the synth or string pad. Then you have the brass, the trumpets, trombone, and tuba, and then finally the woodwinds, the oboe and flute. Before I delve deep into the instruments themselves, I would like to let you know that I added no effects of any kind to the instruments, besides a touch of reverb to tie everything together here. By the way, if you're adding room reverb to your track, make sure you create a separate channel specifically for the reverb like you see here. Have all the instruments routed to this channel and adjust the reverb setting to each instrument here. Don't just slap a reverb on the master channel or you'll have to contend with muddiness in your song. The piano introduces us to Aerith's theme, but appears nowhere else in the music. In my eyes, this is a great decision actually, because when you get to the part where it loops here, the reintroduction of the piano creates an incredible contrast to the loud orchestral arrangements we've seen before here. The piano itself is fairly simple, not too dark or too bright, with a bit of reverb added to make it sound cinematic. The harp is introduced as a doubling instrument alongside the piano. I think that the piano by itself would sound a little too cliché, but with the harp the overall sound has more of an attack and feels a bit brighter as well. Next we have the strings, which are separated into three distinct instruments: the high strings, the cello, and the string and synth pad. The high strings primarily serve as the lead melody when the piano drops off in the intro here. They also assist in padding the music, both in the expanded melody section and in part of section 3. The cello, evidently, gives the low end, and you'll often find it doubled with the tuba to give extra emphasis. Finally, the string and synth pad, with its slower attack, gives a nice warmer feeling to section 2 and beyond. The brass play an important role in the song, giving us basically all of the countermelodies Eumatsu laid out in this piece. If you played or listened to Final Fantasy VII, you will notice the brass is featured throughout the score. In this big sequence, it must have been an easy decision to include these three instruments. In the woodwinds, we have the oboe and the flute. The oboe takes over the melody duties from the high strings in section 2. So overall, looking at the melody arrangements of the piece as a whole, we first begin with the piano, which transitions to the high strings in the melody expanded section. Then in section 2, the oboe takes over. And then it kind of slowly transitions to the high strings again. And then finally, there's a solo oboe break, and then the loop back. So, composers can often get away with reusing old material by just replacing the melody with a new instrument. Anyway, the final instrument is the flute, whose only role is to give background to the brass and strings in section 3. Now let's take a look at the actual structure of Aerith's theme. The song begins with this intriguing chord, which is a D major chord with an added 2 and a minor third. Next, we move on to an A minor in first inversion. So just taking these two chords already gives us a nice call and answer type of melody. We first hear the rise in the first chord, which then resolves back down in the next chord. However, there is still a tinge of tension in the chord, so let's move on. In the next three statements of the first chord, the melody line jumps around a bit more. When it hits the C sharp, it actually completes a D major 7 chord. Major 7 chords happen to be one of my favorite chords to use due to their melancholic feel. In the last chord, which is a D sus, we really want a resolvent, which is answered in a big way when we get to the following section. However, in general, this introduction gives us a first statement of Aerith's melody, which is played on the harp and the piano. These two instruments were probably selected to reflect Aerith's calming and beautiful nature. There's always calm before the storm. Eumatsu lets it all out in this section as we hear most of the instruments combined together. Let's begin with the high strings, which basically carry over the previous melody in the piano. You can hear the recap basically note for note until the composer adds in this extra section here. And here, instead of the D sus chord we heard in the piano before, we have an A sharp sus chord. While the melody up top, which is doubled by an octave, moves around in the Lydian mode. Now remember that the Lydian mode raises the 4th scale degree of the major scale. Afterward, we have this huge tension chord in the G minor. Note how many notes are used in this one chord. We then finally receive our final resolution chord, the D major. Up from the strings, the harp fills in as the background and also somewhat of a rhythm as well. What I like about the harp is the way it removes the first beat of the pattern during the first two measures here. It lets the listener engage with the strings first, which then makes it easier to hear the harp afterwards. Apart from that, there is nothing too special in this section, though I do like the 3-note glissando at the end, which gives a nice touch, and gives increased tension to the G minor chord we heard here. The bass in this section, marked by the cello and tuba, both double each other note for note. The dual nature of both makes for a pleasant rumble and almost kingly quality. The line it plays is simple as basses and large orchestra sections should be. Otherwise they would clutter up the music. Their only role in this section is to punctuate the root notes of the chords. The two other brass, the trumpets and trombones, are the countermelodies to the strings. Both are played in intervals, so starting with the trombones, you can start to see the harp making more sense if you play them alongside each other. Both enter at the same time, and they highlight the same notes as well. Now, as you can see in the intervals, Eumatsu doesn't rely on a single specific interval like a fourth or a fifth, but he moves around his intervals to keep things fresh. Now, while I said that the brass act as countermelodies, the trombones in this brief section here do parallel the strings. Again, a nice way to mix things up. The trumpets enter precisely a measure later after the trombones. They also use varying intervals. And there's also a good example of contrary motion right here in the beginning. One last thing I want to note is the fact that both the trumpets and the trombones are performing differently, different notes, different intervals. A lesser composer might have just doubled the two, but Eumatsu realizes the difference in tone between them, and utilizes them effectively here. Let me play the whole section now, so you see how all the instruments come together. After the smooth fade-out and brief introduction of the oboe, we now entered into this more beautiful and melodic section. The instruments here are cut back to only the oboe, harp, and the string pad. The harp is now more prominent due to this. Again, only simple upward arpeggios are what the song needs at this point. This is one effective way the harps can be used. Let's take a look at the pad. Notice the much slower attack of the strings compared to the high strings before. Slower sections in music need this sort of gradual movement. Interestingly enough, the chords themselves are also simple. So not only does Eumatsu strip back the number of instruments, he also makes the notes these few instruments play even simpler. I won't go over too much detail on the chord progression here, but note the movement of the bottom note of each chord. During the first four measures, the bottom notes continually move downward. And then in the next four measures, they alternate between the A and the G. You can see that the chord progressions never quite give a place of stability, and often use a mix of both major and minor chords. For the oboe, the composer actually uses the same notes as we found in the piano intro. He chose to add some variation, of course, by moving about the D major scale. By using the same rhythmic pattern as previous melodies, it's a great way to connect different sections of your song together. Later on in section 2, a second oboe is added, which brings extra attention to the piece. Once again, note the differing intervals the oboes use. The second half of this section, of section 2, adds both the tuba and the trombones, and later on the high strings. The articulation of the trombones actually remains at a piercing level, which is quite interesting. That's why I had to turn down the volume of the trombones in this section quite a bit low so they wouldn't dominate the mix. The high strings add weight to the already playing string pad, and the two complement each other so well. Take a look at the dynamics I use for these strings as well. Notice how I push the strings into this high D note here, which builds a little excitement in us as we try and anticipate the next note. String orchestrations like these would just not be the same without dynamics. And here's all the instruments played together. We start to hear more and more instruments being added into section 3, almost like it's bringing back the first section of the music. The flute, briefly before this section, doubles with the strings to transition to the following section. For the first time, you can start to see more of the same intervals here, the third, in the flute. Now, I'm not saying that using the same interval across a piece is bad, but it's always nice to hear some variation from time to time. For example, right at bar 27, you can hear that the Eumatsu instead opts for a fourth interval in the flute. Which gives a more resolute interval. It's a very good texture in this part of the song with the strings combined. As a final note for the flute, see how they are always accompany the high strings, which more or less completes the chord of the movement. The high strings retain rights of the lead melody away from the oboe for the time being. With the slower attack of the string pad before, the biting sharper strings contrast well to increase the scale of the music. The strings also tend to repeat a lot in this section, which is a common technique composers use for melodies, such as these three notes here. And also right here. The second half, though, breaks that mold by playing around the D major scale here. Like in section 1, the trumpets and trombones again serve as the countermelody to the strings, which is another parallel to the first section. It's fascinating how the composer added this quite dissonant chord here for only a second to intrigue the listener's expectations. Also, there are more similarities to the first section as well. First the high strings enter, then the trombone, and then trumpets. So it's a different melody in general, but still the same structure. The only thing that is different is the lack of harp here. Eumatsu also removes the trombones briefly here. Again, you don't need to have every instrument playing in the entire section for effective composing. One last thing is that the trombone and oboe both reflect the same three-note pattern we saw back in section 2 right here. Which is the same as this part. So it's a nice way to tie every section together. There is clear involvement of the bass during section 3. The string pad begins introducing its low notes right at the start of section 3, because notice how light the previous section is. Then you hear the bass. Then the cello comes in a measure afterwards to really push the bass forward in the mix. Also, with the attack of the string pad, the sharper attack of the cello adds to this effect. Throughout most of this section, the bass of both instruments often move in contrary motion to the high strings, especially in measure 26. So the high strings move downward and the bass move upward. In the last part of section 3, even the tuba joins in the low end, once again moving in opposite directions the high strings are playing in. Now let me play the whole section with all the instruments. There's no greater contrast to the full orchestra than a solo instrument. The oboe is an interesting choice as it provides a longingness even when it's played in major, perfect for the situation in the game when the song plays. As like in previous melodies, the oboe plays along the D major scale. And in one of Nobuo Eumatsu's greatest moments, he brilliantly connects the solo oboe with the piano and harp from the beginning. The last note here is the B is basically suspended, which resolves back to the A. Another great feature of this is that you would expect the final chord here to be major, as the oboe melody was played in major, but the piano subverts expectations by playing in minor. Just a stunning section here. So now let's play the song in full and take note of the things we've discussed before. In the melody introduction, how the simple combination of two lighter instruments can create a unique sound. In the melody expanded, how each instrument enters, first the strings, then the trombones, and then the trumpets. In section 2, the gradual reintroduction of instruments, especially in the second half. Section 3, the amount of countermelody movement in the bass. And finally in the solo oboe break, how a solo instrument can contrast well with a full orchestra. The timing of Aerith's theme during her demise at the hands of Sephiroth is perfect, commencing as soon as Aerith's pearl drops to the ground. I love the fact that this music keeps playing during the battle scene that follows afterwards, a grim reminder of what just happened. It really is scored as a film would be, even during the player-interacted dialogue and battle sequence. Eumatsu expertly conveyed the emotion Cloud was feeling in the whole experience. But what would this scene be without music? Honestly, Sephiroth probably would have been given the primary attention in this scene, instead of Aerith. Inserting boss battle music in the fight would have completely ruined the emotions Cloud and the player were feeling. This is why themes are so important in media. They help in directing the focus to specific characters without a single word of dialogue. And ultimately, they increase the emotion the storytellers want you to feel. Thank you for watching and listening to this analysis of Aerith's theme. I myself have really learned a lot about Nobuo Eumatsu's style, how he combines chord progressions, removes certain instruments at certain times, and a cinematic approach to composing. I hope you learned alongside with me as well. I greatly enjoy putting together these videos to show you the tips and tricks the great composers of the past have put into their songs. Again, thank you and have a dazzling day.